welcome to this session on regenerative dairying. I hope you've all got a steadying cup of tea and a biscuit as we reach 4 o'clock in the afternoon. My name's Jimmy Woodrow and I'm the Executive Director of the Pasture-Fed Livestock Association, Pasture for Life. And this session is a bit of a follow-up from one that I put on at Groundswell last summer, which was looking at the barriers to change with 4 dairy farmers, including one we have here. And it's great to be able to pick up this subject again at ORFC, although obviously sadly online, not in person. The aim of today is slightly different than last summer, and today it's to look at some different approaches to change and at a variety of scales. This session was meant to be in the farm practice room in the town hall, and so we'll try and keep it focused on farmers, and in particular by showcasing things that are happening now that could be replicated elsewhere. To help me do this, I'm joined by 4 really interesting and diverse practitioners who will be covering very different approaches. We'll start first with Angus Dalton, a first-generation farmer who farms 750 acres of grassland with his family at the southern tip of the Peak District. Having initially followed a very conventional path, Angus has moved to a rotational grazing system with once-a-day milking and is now fully grass-fed. The family have successfully diversified into butter, cheese, and most importantly, ice cream, which many of you will have no doubt tasted at Groundswell, which is mostly sold on site in their shop. Next, we'll hear from Francis Clarke, the managing director and second generation owner of Trewithen Dairy in Cornwall. The Clarke family started dairying on farm, but have lately focused on diversification and are now working with a group of 35 family farms who provide Trewithen with milk, which is then sold under the brand as milk, cream, butter, and yogurt. The Clarkes are working with 2 farms in particular to develop a new brand of regenerative milk, which we will hear about today. Then we'll hear from Clare Hill. Clare is the Regenerative Agriculture Director at FAI Farms and has been closely involved in the transition of their 1,200-acre farm in Oxford to regenerative principles. Clare also works on the FAI's consultancy side, which includes with large multinationals, many of whom are in the dairy space. And today we'll hear about this specific aspect of her work and her wider views on the sector. And then finally, we'll hear from Leon Bucher, a Berlin-based consultant who works closely with the German Hub for Land Regeneration and is also a holistic management educator. Leon is going to bring all of these different perspectives together and offer his views on regenerative dairying more broadly. And I also just quickly wanted to highlight another session going on at the ORFC at 9 AM tomorrow, which is put on by the Food Ethics Council, which is looking at specifically dairy regulations. And this includes 2 PFLA members, Rebecca and Bronwyn. And so hope to see many of you there. We've only got 60 minutes, so we need to be quick, and therefore over to you, Angus, and I'll try and keep you all to your 10 minutes. So, Angus.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Jimmy. Yeah, as you said, we're a dairy farming family now, first generation, myself and Sue, first generation dairy farmers, having come through the council holding system and 4 tenancies down the line. Actually feel as if I can say I'm a dairy farmer with roots now and best part of 500 cows here. It sounds a bit cliche, but we have been literally on a journey yet in here. Having been very conventional in thinking, albeit first generation farmers, farming conventionally, even 3 times a day milking at one point. But you just didn't feel things were right. So what was the light bulb moment? And I can sit back and think the light bulb moment was listening to John Roach, dairy consultant from New Zealand, who basically said, the greater the proportion of grass, grazed grass in the diet, the more profitable your business will be. Quite simply, he was right. Nothing more to say to that. Son and daughter, in the meantime, had been to uni, come home, joined the business. Son seen a better future in cows rather than veterinary. Daughter who really wanted to take on board an added value project, which Jimmy just briefly talked about there, and growing the Dalton's dairy side of the business. So that is now an important part of what we do. Ice cream, butter, cheese, and a small amount of milk. whilst there is a small amount of wholesale in there, the vast majority is sold through an honesty shop on the farm. Now, an honesty shop sounds quite twee and cozy and rosy, but believe me, what it's actually opened up for our business is quite exceptional, and it's all part of the whole business. And I think this is really something that you've got to look at when you want to look at regenerative dairying. You've got to stand back and look at the whole outcomes of everything, whether it be the cows, the people, the land, the soil. So why did we switch to 100% grass-fed? It was really, again, standing back, looking at the changes we were wanting to make, and it was a case of, I suppose, really like a least cost option. But the first big change was, to coin a phrase, was that top paddock thinking. That top paddock being up here, of course. Without clear thinking in that top paddock, your systems just won't work. Your cows, your grass, your soil, your infrastructure, health of people, cows, finance, and of course the future. It all has to be stepped back, take a look at it. So our first move was actually crossbreeding the cows. Quite a big wrench that was, moving away from what was a pedigree herd to see lots of little black heifers running around the fields. Neighbours thought we were even starting to think about milking limousines. And it was stepping outside the comfort zone, and certainly people were talking about it. Then, yeah, making sure the cows were smaller, that took a lot of getting over as well. And really learning how to get the best of out of our grazed paddocks. Measuring grass was one of the first eye openers that we really did, and it just demonstrated to us how productive fields of grass could be, to the point that, yeah, feed rep was pretty well made redundant very quickly, and subsequently our finances were £100,000 better off straight away for reduction in feed bill. I can remember that first year it stood out on the accounts. And then really, it's just a case of self-improvement, improvement of the farm, and pushing the boundaries of what you can do on the farm, really, with your grazing. And again, the phrase that comes to mind is graze grass grows more grass. Grazing grass hard grows even more grass. And to get the best out of it, you really have got to look at grazing density, animal intensity on ground, and keeping them moving, making sure that you're fully aware of rest periods on the ground afterwards, and electric fencing and infrastructures all in place. Don't really know what more I can say about regenerative dairying on the ground. It's regenerative dairy. We're here to talk about what's the future for regenerative dairy. Well, it's not actually a phrase that's often talked about, in the livestock sector. Quite simply, in a nutshell, it's not really happening at the moment. Some may talk about it being organic, some may talk about it being sustainable, grass-fed, or even 100% grass-fed. But along the way, us dairy farmers are consuming a hell of a lot amount of resources, whether that be animal feed, energy, land, labour, machinery, and of course fossil fuels in that lot. But I suppose if you come down to the nuts and bolts of it, all we're doing as dairy farmers is turning sunlight and rain into food, just using the cows as a medium. It's not rocket science. People have been doing it for a long time. The thing that's different about dairying, though, is that it requires a critical mass. And that critical mass extends right through from the farm, through the processor, right through to the consumer. It's a critical mass that for so many years now has been determining the shape and the concentration of this industry. People have been striving for KPIs, production per cow, production per acre, production per tonne of bought-in feed, per horsepower machinery owned, per kilo of dry matter grown. All along the way, though, the actual value of the product has remained relatively low, and yet at the same time enjoys a presence in probably 95% of consumers' fridges. Critical mass and concentration has largely been driven by the market, the supermarkets, and along with the processors, taking the costs out of the industry, you know, whilst overlooking what are perhaps the true costs there. There isn't a prescription for regen ag, or regen dairy for that matter. It's a mindset. It's a thought process that, you know, a sense of doing things right, a sense of doing what's right for your farm, your soil, your business, your crops, your livestock, and your people, of course, you. Processors, I think, are going to have to wake up to the fact that regen ag, or more specifically regen dairy, is a seasonal concept. That's nature. That's nature for you. Any processor that had, you know, I've written this one down here, any processor that insists they are going to achieve net zero by 2040, and yet continues to insist on all year round level production of milk to keep their factories going, they're simply deluded, really. To achieve regen dairy, you're going to have to work with the seasons. You're going to have to accept that there's going to be lower production through the winter. There isn't enough carbon credits in the job to run machinery, burn diesel. There isn't enough carbon credits to run all year round forage production, burning more diesel, feeding supplements, burning more diesel, laying concrete, burning more diesel, and then working your staff 365 days of the year, or even keeping your factories running. A huge change of mindset is what's needed. But this mindset's got to start at farm level. It's got to start right on the ground with us all. And trouble is, dairy farmers in this country haven't really got the headspace to take all this on board at the moment. There's too much going on. So I think that headspace for thinking has got to come from higher up the food chain. I think the initiative really, it's no use asking government, it's no use asking for policies. The initiative's got to come from the processors, dare I say it, the corporates, and then ultimately the consumers. But really, I think what's needed then is for clearer thinking on what can be achieved with regenerative, you know, looking after your soils, looking after doing what's right for the farmland and for the dairy farmers. So does that summarise enough for you there, Jimmy?
Yes, thank you, Angus. I thought that was wonderfully candid and thought-provoking. Thank you. There's a number of very specific questions in the Q&A directed at you. I might leave you to see if you can answer those into the Q&A function, and move on to Francis. Over to you, Francis.
Great, thank you very much, Jimmy, and Angus. Fascinating your take on that, and I guess being in this forum here as a dairy processor, but probably falling somewhere between the large scale corporate and the on farm processing scale. We're a business in Cornwall. We're a regional business with 35 farms supplying our milk, and we produce a range of milk, cream, butter, and yogurt, which I'll just take you through a brief introduction to the business in a second. But the background is my brother and I run the business now as a second generation, as joint managing directors. And the business was started 25 years ago by my mum and dad, who were dairy farmers prior to that, and started by processing a small amount of milk off their own farm, and grew to processing all of the milk that they were producing, buying a bit from friends and neighbours down the road, before deciding to concentrate all of their efforts just after the turn of year 2000 on fully being involved with processing and working with those 35 farms to supply the milk. So we're farmers in our blood, at least 3 generations on my mum and dad's side. And the cows on our farm were sold when I was 18 years old. So at 18 years old, I didn't quite know what I was going to do once the cows were sold, but soon picked myself up, went to university and had 3 years to think about it. So, and then ended up back in our business, which is great. So I'll quickly now share my screen and a few slides to take you through. So, so our business, Trewithen Dairy, our ethos, central to our ethos has always been about being respectful, and fundamentally the aspects of our business is around the stakeholders that we have, from staff, suppliers and customers, the environment and community. And we put very high value on those relationships that we have, and we talk about what does it mean to be a family business now that we're that sort of medium scale business. Well, for us, it's staff, farmers and customers and our suppliers, all part of what we call the Trewithen family. So our farmers, as I said, we've got our Cornish milk comes from 35 directly contracted farms, all based within 25 miles of our dairy, which is based in the Glyn Valley, just on the south edge of Bodmin Moor, in the heart of Cornwall. All our farmers subscribe to what we call our true farming standards. That covers a requirement for grazing, as well as herd health monitoring, carbon measurement, antibiotic monitoring, and a number of other things to ensure that the standards that we operate to are clearly demonstrable, auditable, and above and beyond. But I think most importantly, the farmers that we work with is that they are progressive and proud farmers. And out of those 2 farmers, we're working closely with 2 to convert to regenerative agriculture methods. We're 3 years into that journey, and I'll share more of that in a moment in what we call our Earth Milk project. The business that we have, like we said, in being former farmers ourselves, but operating in a beautiful part of the world in Cornwall, we've always taken the environment very seriously. And the growth in the business has enabled us to invest in that environmental platform. So we've already talked to you about being caretakers of the land and our farmers recognizing that through the true standards. But on site, we have a solar array, which can provide up to 1/3 of the site's energy, and the rest of the energy we buy is 100% renewable. We also partner with other businesses and education resources around, and partner on projects such as the Foy River Valley Pollinator Project, which was looking at creating a 10-mile-long corridor for bees up the Foy River Valley, on which our farm is part of that. We are pioneering refill solutions for reusable glass packaging with over 50 refill stations across the southwest, and we're not afraid to try something different, pioneering in a few other areas which we hope to bring to the market soon. So our products, we process into liquid bottled milk, yogurt, butter and clotted cream. Cornish clotted cream being our absolute speciality down here, so hopefully you enjoyed some of that at Christmas, and also our Cornish butter. Our dairy is encapsulating the former cowsheds and milking parlour, now transformed into a modern industry benchmark production facility for our delicious dairy products. You'll see there what you might recognise in the middle of the dairy. There is the original cowshed building, and we are added on all sides to develop our dairy that we have now. We employ over 250 staff across the business, from production and engineering to finance, IT and marketing. And we continue to invest to minimise waste, minimise resource use and create the best working environment for our Trewithen family. Very proud to be a BRC AA+ accredited site. That's the highest grade in terms of food safety and food hygiene awarded by BRC, and the plus means that it is an unannounced audit each year. These the other accreditations there are the PDO standard, and the recently created designation of origin UK protected post-Brexit in terms of the Cornish clotted cream being a protected recipe produced in Cornwall from Cornish milk. So we are one of only a handful of people who hold that and can produce Cornish clotted cream. So moving on to our Earth Milk project and our vision of around ethically conscious dairy. Now, the carbon challenge that we saw, and I think this is, 5 years ago, we're really facing into this and asking ourselves questions: can dairy be carbon neutral? 85 to 90% of the carbon footprint of a bottle of milk is generated on farm. In terms of where we are at the carbon footprint level. This is our latest data that we have in terms of our own operations and on farm. And you'll see that the blue bars there for each of those products, it represents the carbon emissions from on farm. And around 40 to 50% of the farm carbon footprint is from enteric emissions, so the methane from the rumen. And when you look at that, or when we were first looking at that, you're thinking, well, how on earth do you offset that and move this forward? But being farmers ourselves, we're thinking livestock farming must be an important part of a holistic food production system, right? So the use of land that's unsuitable or less suitable for cropping, grazing animals have formed part of the natural ecosystem for millennia, which producing nutrient-dense foods in terms of the meats and milks that are coming off it. That's a natural food that's requiring low processing and should be part of the diet. And what about the positive environmental outcomes from livestock farming that aren't talked about or captured within the carbon measurement? So intuitively, this feels right. We can tell our story, but we can't prove it yet. So that's where we were sort of 4 or 5 years ago, and thinking we need to demonstrate this. We need to be looking at how things can change, but also demonstrating that effect. Part of that, I think, is recognizing that the status quo is not as good as it should be. And making change and demonstrating where we are. So we set up what we call our Earth Milk project. The objectives of that is to use regenerative farming practices to build soil health across the farm, to sequester carbon in the soil, improve water quality, increase biodiversity, and maintain, or we believe, improve the economics of farming and food production. The key, we're measuring many things, but the key measures for us are carbon. It's that detailed organic matter and carbon analysis at 0 to 10 and 10 to 30 centimeters. There are key measures. Water is measuring water quality at the entry and exit points from the farm, and biodiversity, using bird species and numbers as a proxy for the biodiversity on farm. And really, it can be simply distilled into this. We use a combination of soil scanning, soil analysis, and soil health investigation, slate tests, etc., and the farm carbon cutting tool to distill down into what does each farm look like, what are the areas to work on, create management actions. And most of that can be described in terms of diverse lays, targeted inputs, which is reducing inputs, but also using to more natural-based fertilizers, crop management, the way it's tilled, sowed, and the diversity of the crop that's been sowed, and grazing management in terms of rotational grazing, all aiming for carbon neutrality. So what have we got? We have 2 farms with a whole farm approach, a total of 1,700 acres. So we have one, Martin and Bridget Well, that's Leon farm near Foy. They're farming 800 acres, grazing cropping, 370 milking cows, mixed breeds, once a day milking, 3,700 litres per cow. They're spring block calving, they're dry for 6 weeks of each year. They've been supplying milk to Trewithen for 10 years. On the right there, you then have JJ and Kiki Wilcox. That's Trewithen farm near Weybridge. They've got a slightly larger farm, 900 acres, again, grazing and cropping. They have 300 cows, and they're an autumn block herd, but much higher yielding. Still a lot of milk off grass as well, but that's they've been 10 years plus with Trewithen. General philosophy is measure, manage, and measure again. We feel that's really important. Our job as a processor is to be able to tell the story of what's happening on farm, both to our consumers, but also to the other 33 farms who are supplying us, to be able to show the way and show the failures and successes in this regenerative conversion. So we're not as far down the road as Angus, but we are out there trying it and finding out what works. So our timeline is around 2018, questioning a concept of building, and it was a visit to Dowth in Ireland, which really sort of gave us the reassurance that there was a way of building carbon in the soil through regenerative practices, and that attention to building the microbiome underground, the diversity above ground as well. 2009 put together the research and bringing everyone together. We took our baseline measurements in spring 2020. Then 2020 and 21 implementing a lot of change. So herbal lays, rotational grazing, alternative protein growing. We eliminated soya, by the way, as part of this diet from everything, including calf pellets, etc., on the farms, and to see the impact of that. Minimum tillage. Reducing inputs, undersowing maize crops. Interesting around maize, that conflict of can maize even fit within a regenerative system. We're trying various things with maize to keep cover on the ground. And then willow planting as well. Not so much about the grazing, but that's about water filtration and management in areas close to watercourses, but also growing above ground carbon in places that are non-productive on the farm. We're just heading into year 2 measurements this spring, and then the next couple of years we'll be really building on those learnings, expanding the herbal lay acreage. We have one of the farms who's going to be trying silver pasture, and then really the progress sharing and farm walks with the other Trewithen farmers. And then we're aiming to measure every 2 years after that. So I think I've taken up too much time, but generally anecdotal feedback's been positive. And where do we go next with this? It's about sharing those learnings and sharing the stories with our customers, with the ultimate goal to produce a carbon neutral or positive milk for sale. So I'll leave it there. Thank you, Jim.
Thanks, Francis. There was a very specific question in the chat for you about the relative carbon emissions from whole milk and semi-skimmed, I think it was. But I'll leave you to dive into the Q&A. Moving quickly on to Claire.
Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for having me. I'm going to start by saying that in the transcript, it came up when Angus said Regen Dairy, it came up on the transcript as Regen Daddy. And someone's texted me with that and said, that is you, Angus. And I thought that was absolutely brilliant. And following on from the 2 speakers we've just had, I've totally transformed what I'm going to say because a lot of it's been said already. So I'm going to reflect on those and draw out some of them and maybe try and just make 3 key points. Angus, you talked about this is not a thing that we do. This is a way of thinking and a mindset change. And that is the hardest thing because most of us sit within a mechanistic, give me a list of things to do. What do I do? I've got this problem. What's this symptom? What's the solution? And so we've ended up in an agricultural system that we have, of which some people can get quite blamey about some of the problems that we're having. And I see some comments coming up quite blamey. What I think we need to recognize is that we've been all doing the best that we have, all the information that's out there, everything that's government funded, industry research, everything that's best practice has led us down a route where we've ended up with intense genetics, very efficient systems when we look at efficiency under one lens. But when we start to look at efficiency as a whole, like you say, Angus, standing right back from it and looking at what a farm is doing, then we realize that maybe we have created some problems. And no better example is the fact that Holland are now recognizing that they basically produce too much poo and they can't do anything with it and are having to legislate now. We know that ruminant livestock are part of the solution. And often as dairy farmers, I hear, you know, we've got cows, so that's great. We're superb. And that can be, but I think there's a long way to go between where a lot of dairy farms are now to getting to that point, because often we've got cows, that's great, but we've got too many cows in a certain area. And we've become very specialist as a dairy industry across the world. Because that's what best practice has led us to do, not because we've wanted to produce too much manure or we've wanted to have extreme genetics that then require lots of feed to be brought in from ghost acres from across the world, but just that that's the way we've gone. So what we need to try and figure out is, how do we take everybody on that journey and at pace, really? Lots of people use, I hear, oh, we haven't got the data, we haven't got the research, and all of that data and research is important, but it shouldn't be an excuse for starting now. We have exceeded planetary boundaries in a way that is incredibly worrying, particularly around biodiversity loss and nitrogen cycles. And of course, within the dairy industry, the nitrogen cycle is something that is very close to our everyday life. Climate change is a bad one, but it's not the planetary boundaries that we've crossed the most. We've actually done more damage in other areas. And I think starting to understand that can be helpful, can be scary, but sometimes good to face into that and work out, then take a step back on our farm and work out how we can work to come up with a solution. So yeah, the challenge is, how do we work with those with a mechanistic mindset and you just want a solution for X problem, mastitis, lameness, fertility, whatever it might be, to say, let's take a stand back and have that mindful thinking. How do we think differently about this? How do I start to think regeneratively? And I guess that's where a lot of my work takes me at the moment. And for those of you familiar with the ALA pilot program will know that that is a detailed program with 25 farmers where we're taking them through a transition. In the first conversations, it was, can you just give us a list of things they need to do differently? We'll tell them what to do, they'll do it, and then we'll measure everything and anything in between. And then at the end of 3 years, that'll be great, we'll have an answer. And what was, we of course said, oh, hang on a second, this is about a transition, a way of thinking, all the things we've said. And it's been really interesting to see people within ALA even go on that journey. But what we ended up with was a fantastic project. I'm really excited to see that coming to the fore, where it does, we're collecting, the data is very important, we're collecting that, but the focus is on the mindset and the transition and what that looks like for those 25 individual farmers. Because as it's mentioned previously, that it's people that are at the heart of this, farmers, not farms, farmers, and they're the people that are making the decisions and that and are central to changing things. What's exciting for me about regenerative agriculture is that it does put farmers back at the heart. No one retailer can come up with a, you must do this regenerative scheme and it work. We know that every farm is different, and that's what's one thing for me that's really exciting about the regenerative movement. The next thing that we do across the board in farming, and particularly in dairy, is of course our focus is on yield. How many litres per cow, how many tonnes per hectare, how many whatever. If we could only just shift that to be how much nutrient density per acre, how much vitamin C per acre are we producing, we completely change the dynamic of the way we talk about that, because we know that this drive for yield, we know we can get more yield if we put more nitrogen fertilizer in, if we feed more, if we get genetics that are even more focused on yield, we know we can produce more. But we also know that for every action there is a reaction, and unfortunately some of those actions have led us to have some of the negative things we're seeing with too much pollution or whatever it might be. And that's where the processes come in, and Angus mentioned this, and it's great to see what Francis is doing as well, because that often comes from that and comes from a focus on yield. Now, some dairy processors paying on different measures, and there's quality in there as well, and that's great. But also, I think we need to start widening that out a little bit. Is that how do processors help farmers become more regenerative? We know that diversity is key. Nature does diversity. Nature doesn't do monocultures. And often on dairy farms, or any type of farm, really, not just dairy. You know, we've got cows, we've got grass, we've got maybe some cereals, but it's very focused on just the cow production. And if we widen that out, for example, to include fruit trees, to include other types of livestock, like we're asking a lot of farmers to do that. And then if they then are having to sell all of those different items into different supply chains, it becomes really complicated and is a blocker. So a challenge to processes is like how are the processes going to support farmers in their transition and become a market outlet maybe in a wider way than we currently see. And the other thing, we talk about this standing back, having a mindset change, all of that, that's lovely, great, sounds brilliant. But with the day-to-day pressures of running a business, especially one that is so relentless as dairy and 24/7 to keep that production up. I've had a message here from a vet friend of mine, and I'm just going to read it out. She says, "I feel so torn with some of my dairy farmers. They are so busy doing with no time to think of anything else. How can we help them be able to have that time? Like, as an industry, we need to ask ourselves, how do we support that? To give people the time to have maybe to think about a different perspective, to do some training, to have some time off farm, to visit some other farms, to start to think about how we might do things differently. There is no one solution. Some will have a complete transformation, you know, as maybe Angus has had, and maybe me. And then there'll be others who will start off, it'll be a bit of direct drilling instead of conventional cultivation. And it will be, you know, a step change. One thing, I might just do a list of things differently. And all of that should be supported. And we need to find out ways of working with everybody to find their way of doing it. At scale, this is difficult, and this is the challenge that Leon and I maybe have in our work together, is that what we're trying to do is, through our work, is working with big dairy companies, big dairy farms, some of which are housed. In fact, a large proportion are housed. But what's really interesting in the work with the Arla farmers is that quite a lot of people that volunteered or put themselves forward to be part of the program were fully housed. People want to change. Farmers know that change is needed, just don't know how. What do we do differently? How do we start to unpick what we've created here? And especially with the relentlessness of the day-to-day of just keeping a farm going and maintaining high standards. So I think that's, for me, where next is just starting to unpick some of these things and work out how we support farmers to make a transition. That's it from me, Jimmy.
Thank you, Claire. Moving swiftly on to Leon, who's going to add.
Yeah, I was looking at the watch at the time already, and I'm like, oh, we have not enough time.
I have been given authority to run this over 5 o'clock, so we have a bit of wiggle room. But over to you. 10 minutes if you can.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of my thoughts kind of connect to what we've heard from Angus, Francis, and Claire, and I feel like it starts with like that regeneration is actually a spectrum. There's like not like one thing to do: regenerative agriculture, regenerative dairy, or regenerative whatever. We can start wherever we are. So when we say what's next in regenerative dairy, there would be actually thousands of valid answers right now that we could give to it. And it starts with finding like our own place in our own local ecosystem again, and then trying to balance out with our social and economical regeneration, because regeneration is looking at the ecosystem and finding our place, but it's also about like, how do we fit in with our social connections and our economical needs into this. So where do we start? Like Claire said, we are still part of this very linear, yield, efficiency-driven system, coming from the production and basically putting all these production goals and how the machines are run onto the resource base, onto the farms, onto the farmers who work with I always want to say soul, but it's soil, but it kind of fits as well in a way. And what I can hear and see more around Europe right now is that people stop and say, like, wait, maybe all I thought that was right and real isn't. And maybe these tools we use, or tools I use, are not appropriate. And maybe even the targets are not appropriate. And I feel that's where we are also in dairy, but in so many different parts of our society right now. It's this kind of this edge of the mindset shift on an individual level, but also in groups and in our societies, maybe not so much in our government yet, but we are this step. So coming back to the title, like what's next in regenerative dairy? For me, the first question was like, can dairy actually be regenerative? And I feel that's the question that can maybe added into like, can dairy be regenerative in my individual context? Coming to the point that there's no blueprint or nothing like the one regenerative dairy is like, okay, can I figure out like if I can be regenerative with what I'm doing? And these three groups that we have opened and we here in the webinars, like the big groups, the big companies, the corporates, the producers who have heard of this word regenerative and now trying to figure out what this is. There's kind of this group, this middle scale cooperatives like Francis, who have pilots running and projects running. And there's the third group, like the individual farmer, the individual farm operating. And if we start with the big corporates and like Claire said, working with FAI, working with bigger like dairy, like Arla and others, there's not many answers yet. There's a lot of questions. The best answer would be no idea if regenerative dairy works for us or how that could look like. We don't even know what that means and what can be achieved and what can't be achieved. And if we can be truly regenerative or just sustainable, meaning do no harm. So these bigger corporate look then like very fastly to the individual again, to basically this level, like this group 3, the individual farmer, and be like, can you tell me what this is? And can you show me if this works? And farmers like Angus, who actually have to do it because they are the base and the foundation, they look towards their resources. They look towards soil, plants, their animals, their farms, their personal context. And so many out there, when I travel around Europe and travel around Germany, they show, yes, I can do regenerative dairy. They've proven for themselves and their context. And like Angus said, it's like, but how did they actually do it? They often start with the question, again, like maybe all I was taught was wrong, and then slowly start with questioning more and more and researching more and getting more into this feeling of like questions are maybe not that bad, into the shift from this process efficiency focused lens to a way broader, holistic, wholesome, like systemic perspective. And small experiments, I feel like often are always the starting point on farms to like look at like, okay, where can I start with this? Like, how can I actually apply these things? And maybe it's different tools, losing animal impact, maybe it's a different grazing, but slowly working with these experiments and figuring out what could work, searching the internet. I feel like we have so much information available, and it's the question how to put that into knowledge. So once they kind of answer the question for themselves, like why I'm doing what I'm doing, and hey, this actually works in my context, and I can do this for future generations to come as well. There is like 3 different outcomes that I've seen in different projects or different farms here. Either it works, regenerative dairy works for them, and they just like extend what they're doing on their experimental plot to all of the paddocks for the whole farm, and basically add it maybe with other context, like, oh, I can also secure this hillside when I'm doing this, or I'm creating more biodiversity, but regenerative dairy works for my farm, and they continue doing it on the farm. What I also see is that an outcome from this individual farm level can be, oh, regenerative dairy works, but only if I get the whole production back into me, if I keep the value added to this milk, if I make value products out of this myself, and I basically get out of this centralized system and like build more connections and community and local connections again, but stay in dairy. And then there are also people who figure out with their layout of pastures around the farm, they can't do regenerative dairy. So some of them then look into a context, they're like, well, maybe then we don't do dairy, maybe we do cow-calf herds, and find a different model that works for us, works for our context, our local layout that we have. And I think that's part of this beautiful process is we don't know yet what will come out of it. You basically have to figure it out while you go. which can be very scary and which can be like very overwhelming. And I think that's where Francis and this middle-sized cooperatives with their projects and pilots come in, because we love to get some proof beforehand before we start something. We love to see some data or some measurings to get a better feeling of being like, okay, maybe I can do this, maybe I can try this. So there's this group too of these like middle-sized cooperatives have projects to show and demonstrate, yes, we are building healthier soils. Yes, we are creating more resilience for our local systems. And yes, it's context related, but it does work everywhere. And Francis, Whole Earth Milk is one example. There's another beautiful project in the south of Germany with 8 dairy farms who also incorporate like building their healthy soils while using cows with a different grazing approach, and all in their context base to show, yes, it does work. They include science, they include research, because we still want science to also tell us, yes, this does work. So we need this middle level, this middle-sized projects and pilots to also show us, yes, you can do this. So depending on where you are, if you are the big corporate, if you are the individual farm, or if you're like in the middle, like trying to be this cooperative who tries different things, you can do the next steps in regenerative dairy. And for me, if it comes down, what I think about, like, what is the next in regenerative dairy? It's, I think what Claire, you said it last, but like, we need a lot more people doing it. We need so many more people showing that they're doing it, because it's, for me, it's still very hard to figure out who's actually regenerative in dairy in Germany. You basically have to dig very deep and ask questions to find it. But it's a lot about like showing it, getting people more comfortable, and then getting more and more people doing it, trying it. Angus said, like, it's not rocket science. I feel there's no superpower that you need to get working. It's a lot about the rethinking the why, what, and how we are doing dairy, and including the ecosystem as the essential part into this. And then have people to support these journeys, to get over this edge of like, this is scary, and to support the questioning, support this process of actually applying the tools, applying experiments and projects. Everything is context related. I think that all of us had somehow had this in mind of like, yeah, there's no blueprint. Everything depends on where you actually are. If you're facing south side, how much hectares you have and everything. But that's also about the fun, right? It's like experimenting the things and trying out what works for you. And how does this look like on my farm? Regeneration is a spectrum. So you can start wherever you are, start small, try it out, and then scale. And everyone can do it. Even I with my little garden can do it. Maybe not with a herd, but maybe with other animals, I could do it. And what for me is like the most important thing in like what's next in regenerative dairy is there are no dogmas. There are no walls that we want to raise. There's no organic or conventional, or you have to be part of this club or this club to join it. It's about creating these interconnections and these relationships between us again, and coordinate with our neighbors, with our partners, with our communities, instead of being the competition and divided, to actually create all these interconnections that nature does, building abundance and building redundancies to become a healthier system on a local and like regional level or on a very small scale. Because a product is never regenerative, it's only systems who can be regenerating. And after all, regeneration is somehow more about being a social movement. If you actually think about the things that we're talking about the connections that we want to create and have, and who to work with and who to talk to. And everything starts in healing our relationship with the land. And I think that's a beautiful way to start and to end my point of view onto this topic.
Thanks, Leon. That was really, really interesting. And things got so kind of philosophical at one point. I thought the Q&A section at the end was just not gonna do what was needed, and I thought we needed a whole day in a room to really get into these issues. But I suppose I felt at the end you were while not wanting to be kind of clubbed into any particular way of thinking, you were kind of rounding somewhat on kind of the concepts of closed loop farming systems, and how do we use what's kind of freely available rather than, you know, I suppose dairy, like poultry, has kind of become somewhat bloated on cheap energy, which might not be around for much longer. I do, however, have some questions that I've tried to synthesize from the chat and some of my own views. They're roughly 4, and I think we've probably got about 15 minutes to try and get into them. I probably won't come to all of you on each question, but the first one picks up on a lot of the chat that's been going on around methane. And I suppose I sense, and this is something that Francis picked up, is that dairy farmers particularly are going to be staring at trying to offset methane versus trying to offset fossil fuels. And I sense this is a bit of a fork in the road for the dairy sector. Which do they prioritize? It's possible that carbon accounting metrics are prioritizing offsetting methane, not fossil fuels. I don't know who particularly would like to pick this one up. I mean, Francis, you go.
No, I think it's a really, really good point. And certainly in all of the conversations we're having with our farmers, this is about looking at the total. Regenerative farming allows you to reduce your inputs as well as to have the opportunity to sequester carbon in your soil with better managed soils. And it's the combination of the two. I don't think we should ever look at, oh, well, we can paper over the use of fossil fuels with sequestration. It's the combination of the two. And I think Angus touched on it around, the activities on farm that do burn fossil fuels, and we need to reduce reliance on those as well. So it's very much approaching the two ends of it.
Can I come in there then as a dairy farmer? I think the methane story, we know what's right. Methane is a short cycle as opposed to carbon dioxide equivalent. The truth will out on that eventually. The one that we can't get away from is burning fossil fuel. So in answer to your question, Jimmy, we've all got to address just fossil fuel burning, full stop. Simple as, the methane thing, it's there, it's in its own cycle, it's in its own ecosystem, the livestock. So, whether you choose between methane or fossil fuel, there's only one thing to choose to target: fossil fuels.
Claire, do you have a sense of what the big players are thinking in this area?
So it's all about carbon, because everybody's talking about carbon and setting carbon reduction targets, as we all know. And our view definitely is always, let's use carbon, because everyone's interested in carbon, everybody wants to see reduction targets, etc. So for a while we were like, no, don't just talk about carbon, and then we moved it on to, okay, everyone's going to talk about carbon anyway, so let's use that as the lens to talk about everything else. Carbon is not a problem, it's just in the wrong place. Like, it's all in the air and it needs to be back in the ground. And how do we do that? And the methane debate, we know, just to Angus's point there, how people are going to use that, and are people going to start making bigger statements? I think maybe in the future. But I think it's important that we recognise that carbon cycling is one part of this. Biodiversity loss, water cycling, flood and drought, extreme climate events, all of those things all linked to carbon, but they're not the only thing. And that's our focus at the moment, is working with the big brands on that, of which there's a recognition of it. It's unfortunate that often it comes out as just we're going to be X amount of carbon neutral by X year, when there's not more depth behind it. But people are so overwhelmed with information, they can only cope with small bite-sized bits of targets, and that's where it ends up going at the moment.
Well, Claire, it's quite simple. The carbon is man-made, not cow-made. It's fossil.
Yes.
It's fossil derived. So whilst we can talk about carbon cycles and diverse ecosystems and everything, coming back to the question, it's binary. The binary question was methane or carbon, fossil fuels. It's fossil fuels we've got to target.
Yeah.
I then wanted to pick up on the issue that Angus briefly touched on at the beginning around seasonality, and I wondered if any of the other panelists, maybe go to Leon first, because you didn't speak on that last question. Do you feel that the dairy industry needs to be looking at seasonality perhaps as a binary issue to what Angus just said?
feel it has, like, it depends on from which angle you look at it. So I was like not coming from dairy, but working with a bigger frozen vegetable supplier, let's call it like that. And we were talking about that. They said like, oh, we can tell our people what to grow, so we can always have these things. And it's like, what would it be if you actually use what can be grown in the seasons? Like, what are the things that are available and that are healthy in our ecosystem and healthy within our farms? So I feel like the seasonality is something that nature provides us. Seasonality is something very natural coming. And the question is more like, how can we diversify more, that we're not dependent on that one single thing. So I feel like if we know that their seasonality happens, and market gardeners like in orchards, they all have seasonality. The question is for me, maybe like more like, yeah, how can we adapt to this? And is this on an individual level? Is this on a farm level that I think about diversity, but also on the cooperative level, and also maybe on the big corporate level to diversify this approach?
Anyone else have a kind of strong view on seasonality? Francis?
Well, I think coming at it from the sort of processing angle, I think the reality is we sell bottled milk, and the demand for bottled milk is pretty much the same every single day of the year, apart from at Christmas when everyone goes crazy the week before and doesn't buy anything the week after. But it's pretty consistent all year round. So to cater for our current demand, if you like, as a nation, there needs to be an element of production around the year. Now, I think what we're seeing a trend towards is block calving systems. Spring block calving being the most traditional way, and presumably Angus, you'd be calving in the spring, but also autumn block calving. Now, the reason that we in the Earth Milk project that we've set up is have one spring and one autumn block carver, is to try and understand, how does regenerative farming fit with that winter production of milk, that growing of cereals and proteins and forage crops for the winter production. And that's something we don't know the answer to. Will we be able to make much more rapid progress with the spring-based system versus the autumn-based system? We don't know, but I think it's an important part of the question that we have to look at. So that's where we are. I think in terms of where we go, there are dairy products out there that can be manufactured into cheese, butter, milk powders if needed, to be able to balance that seasonal thing. So it's probably a blend of the two, becoming more seasonal based, and then trying to work out how we can produce milk through the winter as well on a regenerative basis. I'd be really interested in your view around that, Angus, because you presented quite a strong view at the head of this webinar.
Do you want me to come in on that?
Yeah, please do.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I'll come straight back at you as a processor. Don't take it personal, but the industry has kettled these dairy farmers down the tunnel, if you like, of all year round milk production, because we've got to keep our factories going, and it's a known fact that the prices paid for winter milk have never been enough, let's say, to pay for all the resources that's needed, because it's not just feed, it's not just feed and diesel, there's infrastructure all around it all. It's concrete, it's that massive investment. And now all of a sudden, if you take the industry as a whole, they're hooked. A lot of the industry are absolutely hooked on a high capital investment that they've got to pay off, and which leads to the need for more production, instead of taking a step back and just looking at what can actually be produced from the resources that you've got, instead of going out and borrowing more money to use more resources to produce your milk, in a nutshell. Sorry, we're digressing a little here.
No, that's good.
I think, it would be interesting to see what your autumn herd comes out at versus your spring herd in the big picture. Spring herds are a lot less seasonal when you actually take into account their not necessarily the production profile, but their profile of milk solids produced. Spring herds are a lot less seasonal than people actually give them credit for, you know. And I think, again, it's back to this mindset. People think, oh, we've got to have milk all year round. We've got to have milk all year round. No, I think there's better ways around it from the processing angle.
I want to move on to a different subject now, but come back to you, Francis. And there have been a few questions on the kind of consumer side of things and how we can develop markets to kind of replicate what you're doing, perhaps, and to make sure that this milk that's being produced in a more regenerative way isn't just going into the existing commercial markets. Have you got a view in terms of how we can get more farmers working cooperatively like you're doing?
Well, it comes to, it's my belief that we can and should add value to the milk that's being produced in this way. I think a big amount of that is telling the story. Educating is too strong a word in my view. It's about being able to just take consumers on the journey and explain the differences and tell the stories of what's happening and as we go. There's been a lot of talk around, you know, should there be a standard for an auditable standard for regenerative farming, you know, to give it the premium like organic milk. And you know, I think the jury is out on that at the moment. But I think for me personally, this would be about in these next years of transition, ensuring that there's value kept in it. We tell that story, people understand the differences, but ultimately moving the entire industry in a direction so this becomes more the norm in the longer term. So and as Leon was saying, there's degrees of regenerative farming, and it means very different things to different farms, different soil types, etc. And I think being prescriptive would be the wrong thing. It's about, you know, and Angus has said, it's about keeping an open mind. It's about, you know, and I think it's that philosophy of that is so valuable with regenerative farming at the moment.
Leon, are there any examples from, I know you mentioned one in your talk, from Germany of ways in which there's a bit of momentum growing behind these alternative models?
Different ones, yeah, in different directions. So they either like there's a way of coming together in, let's say, like a loose cooperative, not a real cooperative, but like cooperating with each other, like sharing a compost turner or sharing like the insights, helping each other out. And there's more and more like from the non-farming side, people coming who said like, we would like to help you connect and enhance what you're doing, and like that you can sell to the best price and you don't need the whole chain in between, and supporting more like digital solutions or supporting actual like fridges or anything to connect farmers and help them sell directly, basically. So I feel like there's no one way. It depends a lot about the region, and it depends a lot about the farm, where the farm is. There's another area where there are 3 farms quite close to each other, and they were in competition, and they're now thinking about like how can they actually work together and not against each other, because they're all in for the regeneration and for the movement, and it would be very sad if one of them goes out of business again. So I feel there is movement, but in completely different directions, depending also on like where people are. And if they have, for example, just 10 cows, or if they have 250, and how much leased land they have and how close they are to others, what kind of model makes sense for them.
Thank you. Before we get kicked off, because I'm pushing my luck here, I'm going to end on a question which I think is tailor-made for Clare, which is around biodiversity, and in particular whether, let's say, 100% pasture-fed dairy approaches might need to be fairly intensive when it comes to their grazing management to ensure that the animals are getting enough food, I suppose, and whether that puts undue pressure on things like pasture biodiversity. And I suppose it's a question about how we make sure all these things are being balanced in these more regenerative systems.
Yeah, so I guess if we took having to feed a current Holstein Friesian high yielding animal, possibly yes, it's the point again about taking a step back and looking at what we're trying to achieve and matching the grazing management and what's been planted and how that land is being managed with animal performance. It also links into a focus back on yield. So what are we striving for to deliver on our farm, and what's the yield, and what animal is best suited to deliver that? So likely that a high yielding animal isn't going to perform best on a pasture that is being managed to deliver on both feeding a cow and on biodiversity. But also I see someone's posted the Janie experiment in the chat. There's some really interesting work that can challenge your thinking a little bit. So for example, when you go over 7 or again 16 or 23 species, what starts to happen in the soil with the connection and contact and communication with mycorrhizal fungi and the bacteria and everything else is releasing nutrients and minerals in a way that we maybe don't properly, I certainly not got my head around, in a way that we don't understand. And at the moment we focus on just feeding for energy and protein, but actually we're feeding for energy and protein, but then we're having to supplement for minerals, we're having to supplement energy, we're having to put all this other stuff in to support the cow to keep her going. So I think, if we try and take a current cow and just get all of their energy needs from grazing in that way, it could possibly be that biodiversity is getting compromised, but also how you manage that grazing. So do you focus on utilization on a ryegrass clover only lay, or are you focused on rest period on a really diverse lay? Those two questions straight away will change the dynamic of the answer. Angus, I saw.
I'll come back to, just straight away with the cow there. Don't underestimate how resilient a cow is when she's not under stress.
Yeah.
Which is one of the unintended things we saw from going once a day. We don't see a vet now, basically. TB testing is the only time we see a vet. 500 calvings last year, we didn't have one assisted. Antibiotic use is pretty well non-existent, and we're not organic. We're probably using less than your conventional organic farmer, if there is such a phrase there. Don't underestimate the resilience of a system that isn't under stress.
And there's beautiful studies and papers and books done by Fred Provenza, for example, who actually shows these things that systems need to adapt, or cows who have been fed hay or anything need to adapt, but they are more resilient and they are as productive, but way healthier in these natural systems. So it can also be done under based on studies, the things that we observe and see.
I think we're going to have to stop now because we've got ORFC people coming in, and I think I'm being messaged. So I just wanted to say thank you very much to the fantastic panel, to Leon, to Francis, to Angus, and to Claire. Thank you everyone for joining, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.